this conversation about the context of governing for vulnerable people. And safeguarding has always been critical to it. The key functions of it are a responsibility of board and leadership groups, but we still grapple with what is the concept in relation to good governance. What I've put up here on this slide is, if you like, the four-piece puzzle of a governance framework. And I really wanted to discuss with you then how safeguarding plays its part in these four elements. So, for example, corporate governance and preventing harm really underpins the authority that you have and the trust that is provided to you for your organisation to exist. It doesn't matter which organisation it is, from church to a scout group to an aged care service. Our community has entrusted you to prevent harm for those that rely on your service. And directors and leaders have some specific accountabilities to this, and it's part of your governance and strategy regime. So safeguarding has always been part of, if you like, corporate governance. The other aspect to your governance framework is risk management, and your organisation needs to have the capability and the effective risk management to identify specific risks to safeguarding, not just general risk, but also specific risks to it. And I had the opportunity to speak about risk management frameworks yesterday in the care session that I conducted. And this is being highlighted consistently, that risk management frameworks aren't keeping pace, that they're focused on not necessarily the important matters of particularly faith and care-based organisations. And risk management in many respects has let us down, and we've allowed that to happen. The human rights aspect to governance has, often seen as sort of an abstract element to it. Yet taking a human rights approach, in my mind, is just a no-brainer. I think most people want to take a human rights approach to governance, but the regimes often fail them or lead to an adequate address of human rights. So in terms of safeguarding and the prevention of harm and being able to live the life I want to live and to take the risk I want to take, safeguarding and human rights, as I said, is a no-brainer. And finally, we know that there is heightened regulation, and good regulation serves a good purpose. We don't necessarily see regulation protecting individuals. In many instances, regulation has in fact worked more for organisations than individuals, and there are a number of examples of that could be pursued. But what we do know is that creating comfort from compliance, as both Estelle, Barb and John have alluded to, is often problematic in its own right. Frameworks aren't keeping pace, and this is adding a vulnerability to effective safeguarding. And finally, unequivocally, poor culture and mistrust in institutions that we have for long trusted, such as faith, like our churches, but also our democracy and the questions we have about politicians, our aged care system, our disability services. We've seen more royal commissions in the last 10 years focused on social care than we have since Federation. So there is unquestionable challenge to how your organisation is conducting itself. And a good safeguarding model is about acquiring and maintaining trust. It's about to the environment and the community in which you offer a service or support and saying trust is important to us and it's a really critical asset. There are three ways I believe that an organisation should pursue a safeguarding framework and to continue to monitor it. So keeping it rather simple. Focusing on preventing abuse is obviously the number one thing, and that involves having some critical controls in place. Leading a safe culture, as has already been discussed and validated by other presenters, and going beyond compliance. And I just want to talk about these three aspects quickly with you. Preventing abuse. In risk management, we talk about the criticality of controls, and my advice, and the advice is based on lessons from losses from organisations that do this well, is that there are 5 critical controls that should be part of your framework. So if you take a moment just to reflect on these 5 and think about, do we create enough focus on each of these? Are they part of the way that we consider our safeguarding framework? Do we sometimes focus on one aspect more strongly than another? And do we have some weaknesses in what we're trying to achieve through these 5 controls? I'll touch a little bit more on leadership and governance in the next slide. But when you think about that, there are some critical components to leadership and governance that should concern particularly leaders. One of the big things that I see with this is that there's an acceptance that management or what's happening in our environment is adequate, and these sorts of matters couldn't happen in my aged care home or in my childcare centre or in our church. But we know that they do, that they will, and that they are. And so a good leadership model is always interrogating, unfortunately, where might be the next opportunity. One of the pieces of advice that was issued by Professor, sorry, I'm just looking at my documents, Daryl Higgins, was that boards need to be more focused on the modus operandi of perpetrators. And I think that's a really good piece of advice, to understanding that it's more than grooming. And grooming in an awful way has got smarter. And the ways in which people groom have got more complex. The way that people are able to interact with children through technology, by normalising behaviours through social media and so on. These are ways that an organisation pursuing safeguarding needs to be on top of what's happening in the environment. The next part is effective policies and procedures, and without going into detail, there are suites of policies and procedures that need to form part of an overarching safeguarding approach, not just for safeguarding, but because you run an organisation where a positive risk culture is important. Things like prevention of abuse policy, identifying signs of abuse, policies around recruitment and screening, incident management and record keeping. Recruitment and training is a really important element to this, central to it. And we focus a lot and have increased focus on the ways that we screen and recruit people, which has been really important. But that's the first chapter in the book, not the final chapter. Preventing bad people, we know, just isn't enough. So, for example, again, research conducted by Professor Higgins indicates that the majority of offenders actually do not have a criminal record. So by just focusing on eliminating bad people, keeping bad people away, isn't enough for a systemic approach to understanding what is required in our organisation. Code of conduct, I guess my point about codes of conduct that have been around for a very long time is that they can be particularly useless unless they're really backed up by actions and practice. And once again, if trust is an asset, actions and practice is your way of demonstrating that you're doing something about behaviour, that you're setting the tone and expectation in the organisation. Finally, incident reporting and response I see as a big weakness. Underinvestment in systems, not having an ease of access to be able to report something instantly, not collecting information that might lead to a report, and not backing this up with systems that are easy to demonstrate your actions and to support the people who are reporting. Combine that with whistleblowing, combine that with that for vulnerable people in many organisations, the ability to report is actually beyond them. We've created a world where we assume that the system that we have in place is open and accessible to everyone, and we know that it's not. So these 5 controls are really important. My practice point for you here is to risk assess against these controls. Not assume, not create information on what's in place, but to think about, well, what are our objectives of each of these 5, and what are the risks to those objectives that we need to have some focus on to give us some assurance that we're working towards a continuous improvement approach to safeguarding. We've talked and heard a lot about culture already throughout this session, and culture eats strategy for breakfast. I can't give you any more important message than what we have learned from failure is that culture has played always a significant part in it. So in setting expectations with and understanding behaviour, I like to be a fairly practical person with this. I mean, because culture can be wrapped up in a lot of things. How you see culture, how I see culture, very different. Our experiences with it are different. But when it comes to getting an understanding of behaviours and what leads to behaviours, over time, I've come to believe that this model helps. The A plus A plus A equals B. The accountabilities and how the accountabilities are communicated and managed in your organisation. Who has the roles, who knows what to do. How aware are people of your approach to safeguarding? Have you set the tone? Do they know what to do in the case of reporting an incident? But more importantly, do they feel safe? So being safe and feeling safe, I think, are two different things. So what is the awareness of the organisation around that? And finally, what are the attitudes towards this? Is this everyone's responsibility? Is it board's responsibility as much as it is the person who is looking after the child? What is everyone's responsibility in terms of a safeguarding and leading a safe culture? So my practice point here is really to align your assessment in understanding your culture to these three aspects.